Gratitude to Derek for agreeing to lead this. Derek, in addition to being an expert in the world of youth ministry here at church, also is an expert in Transcendentalism and Nathaniel Hawthorne and others that we'll learn about throughout this virtual pilgrimage. So thanks, Derek, for saying yes to do this. And I'll let you take it from there, and I will watch the waiting room and manage any other technical questions that come up during this time.
All right, cool. Welcome. And what I'm going to do shortly is just switch over to a presentation, because I want you to see some pictures, and I'm putting some text up that we can look at together as we get in and talk about the Transcendentalists. And so you also don't have to be subjected to my midday sun forehead up here. So if, as we're going along, you have any questions about anything I talk about or want a little bit more explanation, you can get my attention somehow, either put it in the chat or something, and we can come around to it, start waving frantically, and I'll see if I can see you. Okay, so with that said, what I'm going to do here, share my screen. So you can see this grand old PowerPoint. So what we're talking about today is the beginnings of Transcendentalism. This is going to be the first part of some parts on the Transcendentalists. And so we need to start our story with the beginnings. And before I jump into the story, I just want to make sure everybody can hear me fine, can see my screen. We're doing great. Awesome. So I'm humbly following the Transcendentalist lead and calling this first revolution, because that's, in their humble way, what the Transcendentalists were trying to do. They wanted to start a revolution. They wanted to start a revolution in religion. They wanted to start a revolution in politics. They wanted to start a revolution in the arts. Whatever sphere they were in, they wanted to completely, fundamentally change it. So just small goals, very small. And as I'm thinking about what the best way to start talking about Transcendentalism is, and knowing that there's several different ways we can jump into their story, I thought about starting right with the big conflict that was near and dear to their hearts, and that's Unitarianism. So Unitarianism, shall we say, proper in the United States, can really be traced back to one sermon that the Reverend William Ellery Channing gave on May 5th, 1918. And this is Unitarian Christianity, where Dr. Channing laid out the tenets of this radical liberal theology. And it sort of puts the flag in the sand for it's now okay to be called a Unitarian. It is something distinct from the different Calvinist congregations that were all around New England. And within 8 years of that, Channing was pressed and more or less reluctantly agreed to help found the American Unitarian Association, which brought together all of the churches that were being identified as Unitarian. And they formed an organization. Yay for organizations. But between 1825, when the American Unitarian Association was formed, and within the next decade, there were going to be some seismic shifts. So we have the Unitarians, who are a formal, we're going to put that one in quotes, a formal association they only exist for about 10 years when we have the problem. So our problem, as said by Converse Francis, who's a Unitarian minister in 1836, is basically saying up at your seat that Unitarians as a group are going to split in half. They're already waging a civil war amongst themselves. And on the one hand, you have, we're going to say the old school, as Francis is saying. The old school would be the English school that belongs to the sensual or empirical philosophy. And then there is the new school. And that's the German school, because they belong to spiritual philosophy. And there's that big list of everyone he's listing up top of George Ripley and Brownson and Alcott and Furness. Those are all the Transcendentalists that are publishing these books and these pamphlets. And they're the new school. They're all for Germany and spiritual philosophy, and not so much into England and the sensual or empirical philosophy. And so here's the problem. Our battle lines are drawn in this revolution of Unitarianism that hasn't been around that long, but it's already too old and stagnant for some. And we want to sort of look into this problem. Why is it that the Transcendentalists don't like the English school, the sensual, the empirical philosophy? And what in the world do they mean by the sensual empirical philosophy? Spoilers, what we mean by sensual is going to stay very G-rated. This is not that type of sensual. I'm sorry if you were starting to get your hopes up. This is British after all. Versus the German. So let's dive in, and we gotta talk England. And if we have to start anywhere in England, especially when it comes to empirical philosophy or the sensualist school, we have to start with this guy, John Locke. John Locke is incredibly important thinker, philosopher for the West. The United States owes a great deal of debt to the philosophy of John Locke, who many claim was a Unitarian. He did have a lot of connection to Unitarian communities in the Netherlands and back in England when he eventually moved back there. Whether or not he can ever be considered a real Unitarian, that's hard to say, but that never stopped the Unitarians from claiming him anyway. So John Locke's big thing is when he's talking about knowledge and what it is to know anything, is he believes that humans are born as blank slates. Tabula rasa is how he calls it. And the way we gather knowledge is through the five senses, to have experience. And so that's why it's called the sensualist school, because we're just talking about five senses. You see things, you touch, you smell, you taste. That's how you gain knowledge. And what makes Locke so radical is by claiming if that's the only way you gain knowledge, that means anything that lies outside of those five experiences, you just can't know anything about. It's relegated to the realms of faith and fiction. And what he needs to do, Locke, as the good Christian that he claimed to be, is he needed to draw every type of experience we have back to one of the five senses. or to reason. And his big push in religion is to really show that religion has to be rational. And it's rational by appealing to, again, the five senses. And if it can't be proven to be rational, you throw it out, you get rid of it. And so let's take, for example, his view on miracles, because these are going to come up. For Locke, miracles in and of themselves are irrational. They don't make sense. We do not see any type of miracle in nature. We will never experience a miracle like that in nature, unless, big caveat, there's a prophet. The scriptures Locke is reading have a bunch of prophets, and these prophets make an even more outrageous claim than the claim of miracles. These prophets claim to be speaking in God's name and saying the exact same words that the creator of the universe would speak. And these are ordinary men and women. And that idea that somebody walks out of the wilderness and says, hey, everybody, you got to listen to me because God wants me to tell you all of this stuff, that's absolutely ludicrous. So rationally, reasonably, we know that there has to be some sort of authority vested into that person. Just like anybody who in our current society is going to say, I'm speaking for and behalf of this person, we would want to see some sort of evidence. Maybe it could be something as simple as, oh, here's a letter, they signed it, you can now trust me, all the way up to, well, here is a signed power of attorney. Legally, I can speak for this person, I can make decisions for this person. So we recognize that's sort of common sense. We would want that. We expect that in dealings. And for Locke and miracles, it's the same thing. God needed to give the prophets a calling card so people would take them seriously as prophets. And the only way that God could see to do that is by having the prophets perform miracles, to do something superhuman, to do something only a God could do. And so even though miracles are not rational, the context in what they find themselves in is purely rational. It makes perfect sense to establish that authority. And so their miracles become sort of blasé. They become a signed letter from God to everybody else, just letting us know, listen to the prophets. So that's Locke and miracles, and all of the Unitarians following Locke try and do this exact same thing. They look at scripture or they look at the church and they just say, we need to make this reasonable. And what are the best ways to make religion reasonable? And then we get all the way down to where we're going to be talking. We get a Unitarian minister named Joseph Priestley, who is preaching right during the scientific revolution in the late 1700s. And Priestley takes Locke even further to say, not only does religion have to be rational, religion has to be able to be scientifically proven. So Priestley starts creating or envisioning a bunch of experiments to run religion through. Pun intended. And ultimately, because of his politics, because of his philosophy, his laboratory in England is burned to the ground and a mob tries to lynch him, and he escapes to the bastion of religious tolerance, Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, he gets to set up shop. They give him a Unitarian church to preach at, and he does that for about 4 years until he dies. So he comes over to the United States in 1798, he becomes the face of Unitarianism in the United States, and the New Englanders hate him. They don't have a whole lot of nice things to say about Mr. Priestley. We'll find out why. It's about this time that we get to bring in Emerson. So here we have on our left a nice little daguerreotype of young Emerson. Emerson was born in 1803. He is born in a Unitarian household. His grandfather was a Unitarian minister, proto-Unitarian, we shall say. Very liberal. His father was again, proto-Unitarian minister. Father actually died when Emerson was only 6. And so really everything Emerson knows about his father, he got from his father's library. And that's going to have huge importance, not necessarily on Emerson, but on Henry David Thoreau, who starts borrowing a bunch of Ralph Waldo Emerson's father's books of a very specific type that if you come back next week, you get to learn what those books are. So, incentive. Emerson, he was an okay student. He didn't do that well in school. And at the day, if you didn't do that well at school, then you became a school teacher because that just makes sense. So he, with his brother, set up a couple different schools. A couple of them were specifically for young women, which was very progressive and unheard of at the time. And he also started private tutoring folks, specifically in Latin and Greek. He did become fluent in Latin at a very young age. And one of his pupils that he tutored at this period was Elizabeth Peabody, and taught her Latin. And she's going to become a powerhouse figure here whenever lecture 3 is. So whenever that is, November, December, sometime, we get it. That one's on mostly Peabody and Fuller. After a while of working as a tutor, he decided that that wasn't for him, and with his brother's encouragement, he entered divinity school, because if you're a poor student and you're an even lousier teacher, you become a preacher. So he did that. As he's going through school, he meets Ellen Louisa Tucker, actually meets her on Christmas Day when she is 16 years old, and he falls madly in love with her and starts a 2-year courtship, just waiting for her to turn 18 so he can marry her. So as soon as she is 18 years old, they're married, even though she's in very poor health. He throws caution to the wind. He marries her. At this same time, he's graduating from divinity school, and he is becoming ordained a Unitarian minister at the Old North Church in Boston. And so the picture of the church building is that Old North Church where Emerson was ordained. It's also that same church with the lanterns and the Paul Revere story, as we can see, if you can make out that little plaque there on the church building. And that's where he started preaching, was actually in that building before the congregation merged later on into the first congregation there in Boston. Now, while he is starting his preaching there at, it was the Second Congregational or Second Unitarian Church of Boston, he's doubting his schooling, because when he was in divinity school, they taught him the good Unitarian texts of Locke and Priestley. And he's reading these texts, wondering why in the world he has to make religion rational. Why should religion be rational? What's in it for me um, if I boil everything down to one of my five senses? Why in the world should the claims of religion be scientifically provable? That didn't make any sense to him. If he wanted science, he would go and study science. If he wanted religion, he would go and study religion. Furthermore, he's reading other empiricists at that time, and one of the big ones is an empiricist named David Hume. He's a Scottish empiricist, and David Hume was such an empiricist that he basically said, you can't really know anything except what you are experiencing this very second. Because as soon as you stop experiencing it this very second, it becomes a memory. You can't experience one of your memories with your five senses, so you can't know your own memories. And you can't know anything that's going to happen to you in the future because you haven't experienced that yet. So the only thing you can literally know is what you're experiencing right now, and everything else is off the table, or it just doesn't matter in the first place. And this sort of shook Emerson up. He wanted his teachers to combat this philosophy. If you're good empiricists and you think that everything comes in through your five senses, how do you refute this? You have to have something. And his teachers couldn't do it. And his senior minister couldn't do it. So he started to get more and more disillusioned with these questions that he's learning in divinity school and continues to think about. But then his young bride dies. They're only married for a year and a half. She dies of tuberculosis. And he wrote in his journal the day that she died that he was calm and tranquil, and his faith is buoying him up. And his faith, we'll put it bluntly, did not buoy him up very long. He just spiraled into a incredibly deep depression. He would walk to her grave every single day, to the point that about 6 months after she died, he dug up her grave so he could lay down with her one last time and spent the night with her corpse. It was about that point in time where everybody else noticed the red flags and how this maybe wasn't the most healthy of behavior, and started to try and talk to him and ask him to take it easy. That didn't happen. He finally begged off and resigned his position at the Second Unitarian Church there in Boston on September 1832. Again, about a year and a half after she died. His cited reason for it was that the religion was too empty. It had no meaning for him, specifically this old ritual of communion. Communion for Emerson was an empty ritual. It had been made way too rationalistic. It had been justified way too many times, and he couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't go through the motions of comforting people when he found no comfort in this rationalistic religion, and he found no comfort in listening to himself preach. And so he decided he just had to leave because the religion wasn't doing it anymore for him. So he basically just went into hiding. And kept going into his depression, finally, people said that he needed to leave and he needed to go to Europe. He had been wanting to go to Europe. That's where the great thinkers were. And people said, well, you need to leave Europe. There's nothing here in Boston for you. You don't have a job. Your wife's grave is here. Go to Europe. Just leave. We'll help pay for you. And so his friends and family helped support him on a trip to Europe. Started off in Malta, ended up going through France, where he started meeting some British dignitaries. The big one would be John Stuart Mill, was a well-known British philosopher, and Mill invited him to come to England. So he went to England, where he met these two gentlemen. And this is our fateful trips. We have Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were going to become lifelong friends, for lack of a better word, for Emerson, especially Carlyle. Coleridge was going to die shortly after Emerson visited him within the decade. So not a lot, that lifelong friendship for those two isn't going to last too long. But both Coleridge and Carlyle have one thing in common among a plethora, and that's they both are very well versed in German. They've both lived in Germany. They have both started translating German philosophy into English. And they are both proponents of German philosophy, and they're more than willing to give that to Emerson. We got to focus on Coleridge for a minute. Coleridge is the founder, along with William Wordsworth, of English Romanticism. English Romanticism, if you've read any of those poems, is all about going out into nature and having an experience that takes you out of yourself. And Coleridge, who is also a Unitarian, he was a protege of Joseph Priestley until he figured out that Priestley was full of it and had nothing to offer him because Priestley didn't like poetry. Went off and wanted to start incorporating German ideas into his religion. And so when he does this, he starts injecting his brand of Unitarianism with the ideas of the Kantians that come from Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant rejected the philosophy of the empiricists. He didn't necessarily like them because he didn't like David Hume and he didn't like John Locke. He thought they were right in one respect, that knowledge, we get most of our knowledge through the senses, but that's not sufficient. Our mind is actively creating our knowledge with us. So for Kant, and this is a really quick recap of Kantian thought, Kant believed consciousness has certain innate structures in it. They're not concepts, they're not ideas, they're just some things that the mind uses to create our experiences. So when sense impression, our senses gather up impressions and sends that information to the mind takes it and shapes it and starts filtering it through these structures. Some of the structures that Kant talks about would be structures of time and space. Time and space do not exist outside of our own consciousness. They are integral parts to our consciousness. Same things like cause and effect. Those are all just parts of consciousness that have no equivalent in any world outside of our consciousness. And you can see what Kant is starting to get at. He's dividing the world neatly in half. There is all of the stuff that is within our consciousness that we experience, presumably through our senses. And then there's everything else. He calls them the things in themselves. And what those things are, we have no idea, because we can never get out of our heads to figure it out. We can't leave our consciousness to see what is outside of our consciousness. We're trapped. And for the Germans, that's the lay of the land. And so that becomes a big sort of mark in modern day philosophy and science that sort of followed Kant ever since. We have everything in our consciousness that we experience, and then everything outside of it. What's outside of our consciousness? I don't know. When somebody can jump outside of consciousness and then jump back in, maybe they will tell us. But until that day, we don't know. And then Kant, what he uses for these sort of structures of consciousness, he calls them the transcendental ideas or transcendental knowledge, because it is not occupied with the objects of consciousness. That would be stuff like a roll or my phone. Those are the objects. But the transcendental parts of consciousness is everything that the mind does to put those things together for us, rather than just a wash of sense impression. Coleridge and Carlyle and then Emerson take that idea and then twist it to say, well, possibly what Kant is talking about is the transcendental knowledge is what gets us outside of our minds and gets us outside of consciousness and starts merging us with the world outside of consciousness, merges us with the things in and of themselves. For Coleridge, he says that in order to do that, the mind and the heart have to be in perfect alignment. And once the mind and the heart are in alignment, they sync together, and then the imagination of the poet can flow and start bringing us all of these incredible universal truths, because that's the universe, the outside world coming into consciousness. And so all prophets are poets, and all poets are prophets, because they're doing the same thing. They have their feeling and their intellect perfectly in alignment, allowing imagination to flow, and that lets the universe in. But for Coleridge and for Carlyle, it's only these very select people. You have only the prophets can do this, or only poets can do this. And because Coleridge was a poet, naturally, he could do this. So Emerson takes all of these ideas and he becomes really excited, and he goes back home to America. And he comes here, settles in Concord into the family home of the Old Manse. The Old Manse is just on the outskirts of Concord. It was built by Ralph Waldo Emerson's grandfather, who was the parish preacher there in Concord. He was a well-known patriot. And as a matter of fact, his grandfather was the army chaplain for the Continental Army under George Washington. And just to give you a sense of how important this house is and how much this family loves America, the Old North Bridge, where those battles of Lexington and Concord are, is literally in the backyard of this house. And that land where the Old North Bridge on was owned by the Emersons. It was part of this house's property. And when they wanted to build this monument at the Old North Bridge for commemorating that battle, the Emerson family donated it to the community, so they could have and make it public land for everybody to come in and tour that spot. And it's still there, and the monument is still there. And the poem that Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote commemorating that day is still there. So you can go that. For our intents and purposes, if you look at the house and you look up at the top floor, you see those windows there. That was Ralph Waldo Emerson's study when he was in the house. And it's there in those windows that he wrote his manifesto. He wrote his essay, Nature, where he tried to fix everything that was wrong, as he saw it, with Unitarianism and with English philosophy, all in one book. And so we have to go into the woods. So he's following the lead of Coleridge in his interpretation. But instead of saying like the universe or anything outside of our consciousness and everything in our consciousness, he divides the world up into two parts. And he calls our consciousness soul, and everything else is nature, capital N, nature. And so the goal of everything is to align nature and the soul, to let the universe in, to let God in. And the way you do that is by going into the woods, because in the woods, that's where we return to our reason and our faith, bringing the heart and the mind together, like Coleridge says. But unlike Coleridge, who says you have to be a prophet or a poet to get these two together, Emerson thought anybody could do it, as long as you had a forest. Just go into the forest, and the forest will teach you how to become the prophet. The forest will teach you how to become the poet. Because as he says, in the woods, standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So everything is being brought together when we go out into nature and are overcome by nature. As he says elsewhere, when the eye of reason opens, when we are in nature, outlines and surfaces are to outlines and surfaces are added grace and expression. They abate somewhat their distinctness of objects. If reason be stimulated to more earnest vision, outlines and surfaces become transparent and are no longer seen. Causes and spirits are seen through them. And so we see that idea of that everything we are seeing with our senses disappears, and we see what's really there, what's really real. And what's really real is nature, capital N, or God, or the ground of being, or universal spirit, or the breath of life, or whatever name you want to give it. That's what's there. So as he's writing this, he's invited to go to Harvard, because Harvard is celebrating its 200th anniversary. And when he goes to Harvard to celebrate its 200th anniversary, the way you celebrate Harvard having its 200th anniversary is you first start with a little reception at the Harvard amphitheater, and then you walk across the street to this building. This is the the first parish church at Cambridge, where you then have a 3-hour-long church meeting. And then when you are done with your 3 hours-long church meeting, you go back to the gymnasium for more speeches. It's around this point where Emerson has enough, and he and 3 friends from the divinity school all sneak out, go across the street the other way to a local bar attached to the Willard Hotel so they can have drinks and talk about the things they want to talk about. And really the things they're talking about is German philosophy. They are meeting on this day, on September 8th, 1836. Emerson's book, Nature, is going to be published on September 9th. And so you know Emerson's eager to talk about all of these ideas. And his 3 companions, his 3 buddies, George Ripley, Frederick Henry Hedge, and George Putnam, wants to talk about him too, because they're all deeply, deeply interested. And so they agree to set up a club. And they spend the rest of the afternoon just talking about who's going to be invited to the club, where it's going to be held, what they're going to do. And they agree to hold it, and it becomes the Transcendental Club. The Transcendental Club has upwards of 40 people. They don't really keep roll. It's just all you have to do to become a member is show up, and then you're a member. And they want to talk about the things they want to talk about, which are things like these are direct quotes from their meeting minutes, their topics of discussion for the day: the education of humanity, or American genius, the causes which hinder its growth and give us no first-rate productions, or the inspiration of the prophet and bard, the nature of poetry, and the causes of sterility of poetic inspiration in our age and country. So they're harsh. They don't like the way America is going. They don't like the fact that everybody is being all rationalistic, and they want people to embrace poetry more. They want people to become more prophets and go out into nature. And so they start writing all of these things, and they start sending them in to the different periodicals. The big one would be the Christian Examiner, which is where all of the other Unitarians are publishing, but the Christian Examiner will have none of it, because the Transcendentalists aren't citing Locke. They're not citing established political theory. They're talking about a bunch of Germans, and nobody wants that in America. So they are flatly rejected across the board. And so to solve that, the Transcendentalists decide to make their own magazine, The Dial, where they can put in their German philosophy and they can tell America exactly what's wrong with it and what America needs to do to fix it. So why The Dial? As Emerson says, that they picked that image of the dial not to represent the dead face of a clock, but a dial as the garden is a dial, whose leaves and flowers the suddenly awakened sleeper is instantly apprised not what part of dead time, but what state of life and growth is now arrived or arriving. So it's that organic metaphor that's bringing them in. And it's from the dial that we are going to get the vast majority of the writings as they start railing against Unitarian religion that's ultimately going to break the religion in half, just like Converse said, with Transcendentalist Unitarians on one side and the Lockean religionists on the other side, until ultimately the Transcendentalists are more or less going to win, until the humanists come in and squash all the Transcendentalists flat. but maybe the Transcendentalists are having a little comeback. I don't know. It's that struggle that is still going on within Unitarianism. Which side is embraced more? The poetic, flowery, loving of nature, can't give two figs for science side? Or is it the strictly rational, it all has to make sense or you throw it outside? Or are we finding ways to bring the two into harmony like Coleridge wanted, the reason, the heart, and the mind coming into contact and perfect sympathy to let imagination flow? But that's what we're going to be talking about at the start of these other talks as we explore a little bit more in depth the Transcendental Revolution. Yeah. All right. So I guess quick, does anybody have any questions? That was a lot.
Thank you, Derek.
Luke had to step away, so we can make fun of him now. About, what is it? What'd you say? When you're not a good student, you teach. When you're not a good teacher, you preach. Oh, makes life interesting.
Well, I have been trying to figure out what Transcendentalism is for many, many years, and I can never keep it in my head. And this has been very to me to sort of get an idea of how it developed and what they were going towards. So thank you very, very much.
Yep, that's fine. Yeah, I was thinking about Transcendentalism, putting it blithely, is the philosophy that they established of the way you can get out of your own head and let God and the universe in, which for the Transcendentalists is saying the same thing.
Man, that's lightweight easier than Mr. Mikester in 11th grade English.
Well, we still have to get onto all of like their social rebellions, but that's next week. This is very much Emerson's version of things, and he's really cerebral and heady. As soon as you get to Thoreau wants to be cerebral and heady, but he's not. He can't put up with a lot of Emerson's nonsense.
All right. Anybody have any questions?
So just pick up on that. So even though Emerson's really into nature, he's really heady.
Yep. So he likes going on walks close to home. But when it gets right down to it, he would much rather be in home reading a book. When
no survivalist skills necessary.
No. When, for example, he was involved, he was invited several times to go and join one of the socialist utopia societies that the Unitarians were always trying to make, where he would go and live on the land, and you'd farm, and you would just be so close with nature because you would be working with it every day. And he passed every time. And it's not just like a little pass, it's a hard pass. At other times, even with when Henry David is living out in Walden, he would invite Emerson to go camping with him, go out to his hut. And Emerson every time is like, well, why don't you come over to my house? I have central heating. And that sort of dynamic is going throughout Emerson's life. He loves the idea of nature. He doesn't like being in it for prolonged periods of time. He only went on what we call these walking tours a handful of times, but only if there was like a hotel at the other end of that walking tour.
He's a glamper.
Yeah, very much so.
But he loves to talk about nature.
Oh yeah.
So that's the joke. You know, there's a path, and you come to a sign, and this one to the left is this way to heaven, and to the right is this way to a discussion about heaven. And the Unitarian turns right
Yep.
and goes to the discussion about heaven.
Yep. That is Emerson to a T. He did. I mean, props to Emerson. At least a little bit. I'll give him a little bit. He talked about nature so much. He didn't, and he recognized its importance because it fit within that German idealism that he was being inspired by, and the English romanticism that he was being inspired by. That even though his actions didn't always bleed into that, a lot of times he did put his money where his mouth was. And so when we'd say proto-conservationists are starting and approaching him for money, he would willingly give it.
Cool. Well, thank you, Derek.
Yep.